Howdy y'all, welcome to the Kentuckian. Glad that you've decided to join us this week. I wanted to make a brief video on why any kind of unity seems to be in short supply in this country today, and really around the world, but especially in the United States. Everywhere you look, there's signs of division. Culturally, religiously, politically, socially, all around there's division. The issue recently that we've had with Israel and Hamas and the attacks that have been going on have illustrated this very, very well. We have many people on both sides of the issue calling for the extremes of either side of the issue. Total destruction / total war, immediate withdrawals of all support from one side or the other, or immediate moving of all people on one side or the other. Basically, the whole gambit of responses on both sides to the extreme. And it's not just in one part of the country or the other. It's friends and neighbors that are having these extreme disagreements that are totally and completely opposite of each other. The us versus them mentality is so rampant today and has led to the destruction of families, churches, organizations, and even whole cities to a large degree. And why does this division only seem to be growing? Is it a lack of empathy or common ground or of just trying to listen to each other? And is there anything that can be done to stop it? Well, the first thing that we need to understand is, especially that last one I talked about, the empathy and the common ground, the trying to listen to each other. It both is and isn't caused or resulting from a lack of empathy, trying to find common ground, or listening to each other and trying to understand each other. It is very true that often we do not try very hard, if at all, to put ourselves into other people's shoes and to understand their perspectives, to find common ground if there is any, or really to just listen to each other. That is true. That is a big problem. However, we often use this as an excuse to do nothing and avoid the hard truth that there is very little to have common ground on or empathize with or listen to in many of these cases and many of these extremes. The growing rifts that we see put people with differing beliefs so far removed from each other that the things that we talked about, that trying to empathize, trying to understand other people, are of minimal usefulness if they do anything at all. You cannot disagree about how the world works fundamentally and have much any truly productive discussion or communication without addressing those fundamental worldviews first. And that's part of what we have to understand. A lot of times it's pushed, well, we just don't try and listen to each other. We just don't try and find common ground, while ignoring the fact that oftentimes there isn't enough common ground to have a real productive discussion on nowadays. There's a lot of talking in circles because of the lack of addressing the underlying assumptions and coming to terms on those first. Let's use this illustration. Very simple. If you think that X action, I'm not even going to apply something to it. You think that X action is always wrong, and the person that you're talking to thinks that X action is always right, and to oppose X action being right is wrong, then guess what? Until you address X action and what you all believe on it, you're never going to be able to find much common ground or have much productive discussion. That's that idea of those fundamentally differing worldviews and ways of looking at reality. If you don't address those, all this talk about common ground and trying to understand each other is really just a waste of time. And we need to understand that. Yes, we could do better to try and put ourselves into other people's shoes and to try and listen and those sorts of things. That's always good, no matter what you're doing. And just as a person, that's good. But you cannot ignore these underlying issues. And the Israel-Hamas thing really illustrates that, because it's two completely different worldviews about the subject. And directly contradicting worldviews, too, let's be clear. But why is it getting worse? Well, one side is going deeper and deeper down a dark, twisted, evil rabbit hole, and the other quote-unquote side, and I use the word sides kind of loosely, is increasingly becoming aware of it and working to pull away from the horrid rabbit hole. And that's not, that the rabbit hole is very large. It encompasses a lot of different issues where the one quote-unquote side is just going very far into it. And the other side is now waking up and like, hey, this isn't right. We need to pull back. Evil causes division. And this is where we start to get into the real, meat of it, if you want. Evil causes division, and people are reacting to it in a lot of different ways. But at the end of the day, it's forcing a lazy, complacent people in the United States, because if we're honest with ourselves, we're pretty lazy, complacent people anymore, to consider what we really believe. And I don't just mean like physically lazy necessarily either. And that's as a whole too, let me clarify, to really think about what they believe and what's right and wrong. When people do that, when people say, this stuff with kids and bathrooms and gender and stuff is too much, for example, or completely fundamentally changing the way this country is supposed to operate or economics are supposed to work, that's too far. What that does is that forces people to think about what's right and wrong. And when you think about what's right and wrong, you draw lines. When lines are drawn, sides on those lines are taken, and then the conflict only increases because of an unwillingness to compromise. And that can be bad or good. If you're unwilling to compromise on good, that will still cause division, but it's good. If you're unwilling to compromise on bad, well, that's bad, and it's also going to cause division because you're not willing to change what you want to do. And that's where we're at right now. But how do you fix all that? Is there any solution to this? And there's different ways that the issue could be fixed theoretically. There are practical discussions about societal separation. You talk about I've talked about this before, I think when it was just the podcast, about differences in culture and beliefs and how borders and countries and those kind of groups are meant to help keep those separate so that there can be a productive cultural diffusion instead of just conflict. And there's certainly stuff that can be said about that, and I think there's a lot of important discussions, right? Physically living away from each other and letting the chips fall where they may, right? If you believe a certain way, you probably shouldn't live in the majority where people believe exactly the opposite. But most importantly is that we hearken back to truth. There either is a standard or there isn't. There either is right and wrong or there's not. There's either good or evil or there's not. And that standard, and there is good and evil, by the way, but if there is, then that standard must be upheld and extolled and promoted, because it's right, and the other side is wrong, with maybe some, obviously, variability or flexibility. And if there isn't, darkness, chaos, and destruction await us to eternity. If there is no standard, there is no hope. If there is a standard, we have to stick to that standard. And that's kind of what it comes to. That's how you fix this kind of division fundamentally. Yeah, you could have a practical solution that splits those people up, but then you're going to see one side collapse and the other side not. And you're kind of just moving the problem. It's still a problem if there's right and wrong. If there's not right or wrong, then we shouldn't even have the discussion and everything will just turn to chaos. That's a fairly dark note to end on. But again, the whole point is we have to go back to truth and to reality and to the absolute and use that as the baseline and build from there. So hopefully it's actually encouraging to you in a certain way. There is solutions. They maybe aren't easy, but hey, a lot of things that are worth doing are not easy. So I hope that you've enjoyed this. Don't forget the social media that we have. If you'd like to support the Kentucky in a more personal way, my Patreon is linked down in the description below. And don't forget about commenting, liking, subscribing. Those little things make a huge difference. Check out the Rumble channel, all those sorts of things. I hope to see you all soon. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this old world. And Ryan Dalton, the Kentuckian, signing off.